Yes.
Dr. Lloyd, we finished tantalisingly with Dr. Gunson's letter of the 3rd of April. We can pick up what you then did in response at NHBT 00-46745. We can see this is an internal meeting, medical staff committee meeting, 25th of April 1991. And if we go to the top of page 3, Hepatitis C testing began on April the 24th, testing for anti-Htv. This would be using the 2nd generation test, which has a low rate of false positivity. The timing of this introduction of testing may well cause some problems with the National Directorate. So we have there, I think, the date on which you introduced testing, and you tell us there it's the 2nd generation test. It was the Abbott test which you used, I believe.
Mm-hmm. Yes, that's correct.
In a nutshell, Dr. Lloyd, what was your reasoning for going ahead in the way described here?
Well, obviously I've written it in my witness statement. We had the wherewithal to do the test. We had the funding was in place. We had the tests available. We had the equipment available. We had the staff who were more than competent to carry it out. Our own internal IT department had made sure that we could communicate the test results into our existing system. And so we were sitting on the start line, ready to go. And then we're told to wait for, and if you look at the last letter from Dr. Gunson, it didn't say, we will start on the 1st of September. It was a May start on the 1st of September. So I felt that I could not delay testing. I mean, we had the wherewithal to remove infectious donations out of our system and therefore reduce the risk to patients receiving the blood. We really had there was no alternative. I mean, you can't not go ahead when everything is in place, just to meet some mythical common start date.
We can see you anticipated in that last sentence that there might be some problems with the National Directorate. Let's pick that up with a letter Dr. Gunson wrote to you, NHBT 00000, so 5 zeros, 62_054, please. And we go to page 3. So 29th of April, Dr. Gunson wrote to you. The first paragraph refers to a telephone conversation. Second paragraph, I'm sorry to learn you'd taken this unilateral decision to proceed with testing without first discussing the issue, not only with me, but with your colleagues in other RTCs, given you must have been aware of the implications for them of your decision. And then he refers back to the ACVSB meeting and to a letter he wrote, which we've already looked at, in January. And then over the page, we see at the top of the page, he refers to the second round evaluation. And then the next paragraph, unfortunately, the timing stated in this letter slipped. And he explains that was the reason for his letter deferring the date to be aimed for as the 1st of September 1991. And then the last paragraph, he says, I've written these details in some length to demonstrate that I'd kept you fully informed of the national policy with respect to anti-HCV testing. There are still other matters which have not yet been concluded. And then he sets out what some of those are. Can you recall what your thoughts were on receiving this letter, and do you have any particular comments on what we see set out in it?
Well, first of all, this letter follows the telephone conversation, which was somewhat harder to listen to than this was to read. Dr. Gunson was, how shall I put it, beside himself over what we had done, and I sort of realized that there would be issues. And then here we have a series of odds and ends as to why they can't do it. Certainly the second round evaluation is referred to, and this comes up elsewhere. And we do now know from correspondence between Dr. Gunson and I think it was Simon Pearl, a lawyer with a firm representing the NBA, probably in litigation, in which Dr. Gunson says that the second round evaluation was effectively a sham. It wasn't a serious thing, and that it was not actually necessary. So we now know that he thought it wasn't necessary, and yet here he is saying we've got to do a second round evaluation, and we've got to, the procurement people have got to do this and that. None of it mattered. None of it mattered. Even if the second generation test had not been available for months, we would have gone ahead with the first generation test. So all of this is just some sort of way for Dr. Gunson to sort of say, I've got all these great reasons for delaying it, and you shouldn't have broken ranks. It was an unpleasant letter. And we can see your response at NHBT
000074_010. You say there, when a common date of 1st of July was circulated some time ago, I made a decision to start testing in April 1991, so we could be assured that not only were all issues of blood and blood components negative for the antibody, but that all units transfused from that date were negative. I set up the internal arrangements, made it clear that testing would start in the region in the early part of the year. The decision to start testing was based on a test that was not perfect, but nevertheless it was available, and it did detect a group of people who appeared to be positive for the antibody. The comparative study of the Abbott and Ortho kits, first generation, was not going to influence my decision as to whether or not to start testing. The next round of comparative trials, which encompasses other manufacturers' kits as well as the second generation kits from Abbott and Ortho, when started, was not going to be completed in time to allow this centre to meet the July deadline, even on the original schedule. The change in date based on a further delay in the completion of the next round of evaluations would have delayed the introduction of testing all transfused units negative by several months, possibly taking us to November of this year. If during that period anyone becomes infected and subsequently takes action, in my opinion, I would have had no defence. We had the wherewithal to test, including kits, equipment and staff, and we'd agreed to start previously. The delay is thus administrative, and that not only forms no basis for a defence or a mitigation, but also, I think, aggravates the situation. I've therefore proceeded on the basis that all units available for transfusion from the 1st of July will have been tested. Now, just in terms of the mechanics of it, first of all, Dr. Lloyd, is this right? Is it right to understand that the routine testing of donations started with effect from the 24th of April, but then there was, as it were, a catch-up in terms of stored products?
Sorry, I lost you then. Could you start again?
Yes.
Is it right for me to...
So in terms of the mechanics of putting screening into operation, is this correct? Routine testing of donations began on the 24th of April, but there'd also be a period of needing to test what was held in stock and so on. And is that what feeds then into this last sentence, all units will have been tested from the 1st of July? How do we understand the reference to the 1st of July?
Yeah, I've reread this letter. I think part of this letter, to be honest, was me trying to protect my own back, using this 1st of July as a date when all units would be tested, when really that wasn't the issue. I think I was trying to say, look, I thought we were going to have things all done by 1st of July, so I had to start in April. The dates don't really quite add up. But we started on the 24th of April. There would be a period, and one can be criticised for this, but there would be a period when units of blood, platelets and so on that were in stock were issued untested. I don't think we went back and tried to retest samples in, from recently collected blood. I don't think we did that, and I'm sorry for that. So the 1st of July really it's a little bit of a smokescreen, not a big issue. The big thing is we started on a certain date. Everything we collected from that date that we put into issue was HCV negative, and it would take a little while for things to clear through the system before everything that was issued was HCV negative.
And then the way you put it in your statement, and I don't think I need to display it, it's just 2 sentences I wanted to read out. A delay until July dismayed me, and a proposed delay until the 1st of September was unacceptable. We all knew that there were infectious donations in the system that were being transfused to patients, and we had the means to stop that. Again, is that in a nutshell the essence of your thinking?
Absolutely. Yes.
Now, you also wrote to your regional health authority, and you wrote a letter to your regional transfusion director colleagues. I'm not going to go through those. I'll just read the references out so that others have a record of them. The letter to the regional health authority, 30th of April 91, was NHBT 0000191_162, and your 2nd of May 91 letter to RTDs is NHBT 0000074_014. What I want to do, however, is now pick up some of the letters that you got in response, or some of what was being written about your decision, and then ask you about that. Dr. Gunson, we've already looked in earlier hearings at Dr. Cash's initial letter to you and your reply to him. We've looked at the letters that Dr. Entwistle and Dr. Marklew sent you. We've looked at the letter that Dr. Bolton sent you, and I don't know if you followed any of the inquiry's evidence, Dr. Lloyd, but he told the inquiry last week this: I now feel quite strongly that Hugh was right. And we've looked at the letter that Dr. Contreras sent you, and she said in her oral evidence to the inquiry, I'm really sorry to have written this letter. So what I'm now going to do is just show you some of the letters that we haven't looked at in other hearings, and then invite your comments. So if we start with a letter from Dr. Fraser, NHBT 0000074_018. Do we have that? So it's not come up on my screen. NHBT 5074, thank you. So 7th of May 91, from Dr. Fraser, picking up in the 3rd line, I feel you're making an error of judgment here and seem to be flouting the advice given by Dr. Gunson, who I thought had made it fairly clear that transfusion centres should not start testing until September the 1st at the earliest. Obviously, we need to have some experience with regard to the newer generation tests. The transfusion service normally acts in unison when introducing new tests for transfusion-transmitted diseases. This certainly happened for HIV-1 and HIV-2. I think it would be far better for you to wait to introduce this test until a date has been agreed for all transfusion centres to commence testing. Was there anything in that letter that led you to doubt your decision?
Oh, no. I mean, there was nothing in that letter that makes you think, oh my goodness, we should have delayed. No, certainly not.
And then Dr. Arler wrote to you on the 8th of May, NHBT 000074_020. Where he says, I'm afraid your decision to commence testing before everyone else has come at a very inopportune moment, for it will seriously undermine the whole concept of establishing a national service, precisely at the time when this proposal is being submitted for reconsideration by the Department of Health. The importance of supporting this concept goes far beyond parochial interests, and the issue is an urgent one. Your view that to defer screening is indefensible in the light of product liability legislation cannot be taken seriously, nor is there any evidence of HCV prevalence sufficient to justify your precipitate decision on epidemiological and scientific grounds. If we cannot work together, we shall decline separately. You've commented on this letter in your statement, Dr. Lloyd.
I did.
Yes. WITN 6935001, page 95. You describe this, top of the page, as a strange criticism to throw at Newcastle's decision, given that Dr. Arler had stated in response to Dr. Gunson's earlier request that they in Birmingham would be able to start testing by April. Again, any further comment or observation on Dr. Arler's letter?
Yes. Faradun Allah's letter was very strange when he talks about there being no scientific evidence. There's not being evidence of there being sufficient infectivity in the supply, words to that effect.
Yes.
So, but those were things that had already been discussed extensively, that we knew that we had a problem, and Dr. Allah wasn't raising any complaints about starting testing. So that argument, I think in the heat of the moment, people were throwing in arguments just because they felt they had to say something, had to come up with something. So I didn't take it seriously.
And then the third letter I wanted to just discuss briefly with you is NHBT 000074_033. This was from Colonel Thomas of the Army Blood Supply Depot, 17th of May. Third paragraph, I must say that I was personally dismayed to learn that you are going to break ranks over the agreed policy on the introduction of hepatitis C testing. As someone who might be considered an outsider and therefore not bound by the collective decision, I believe, and this is the policy of my Director General, that it is vital that we maintain a common front. Only in this manner are we going to navigate the difficult waters ahead engendered by the introduction of product liability and our requirement to be licensed by the Medicines Control Agency. Any observations, Dr. Lloyd, on what Colonel Thomas was saying there about maintaining a common front and not breaking ranks?
Yeah. Well, again, you see that at the end there, going to navigate difficult waters ahead engendered by the introduction of product liability and requirement to be licensed. Irrelevant stuff. And I think, again, as with Faradun Allah's letter, something thrown in just to try and make the point, not relevant. If you decide to delay testing, you're deciding to issue infected units. And these sort of arguments really didn't hold any sway with me, that's for sure.
And then I want to ask you now to look at a letter that you wouldn't have seen at the time. It's from Dr. Cash to Dr. Gunson, NHBT 000074_024. Headed the Newcastle saga, HCV donation testing.
Yes.
I just want to...
May I?
Yes.
May I just... I'm sorry, rather than come back to this after this document, may I just say something about the previous letters that I received?
Of course.
Obviously, I was, fairly upset by the tone of the letters, but I think there were two letters that I received that I'd like to point out were in a much more reasonable tone, and I think it's fair, I should say, that the letters from Dr. Martlew and Dr. Mitchell in Scotland were both, reasonable letters to send in the circumstances, and were not peppered with the sort of stuff that we saw in some of the other letters. So I just would like to make that point.
Thank you, Dr. Lloyd. So I just really wanted to invite your attention here and any observation you have on the last sentence of the first paragraph, where Dr. Cash puts it in these terms: we should make every effort to maximise this disaster to our corporate advantage. And I wondered whether you have any observations either about the concept of characterising this as a disaster or the concept of maximising corporate advantage.
Yes, when I saw this, I mean, it doesn't surprise me in some ways that, Professor Cash wrote something like this. But yes, corporate advantage is really pretty gross. But I don't know exactly what corporate advantage he was trying to make. I don't know.
And then, just in relation to the response of the Department of Health, or sorry, I should say a response of someone within the Department of Health, more accurately, NHBT 00000, so 5 zeros, please, Sally, 62_054. This is a memo from Dr. Raymond to Dr. Metters, 30th of April 1991. He says he encloses a copy of a letter sent by Dr. Gunson to Mr. Canavan. I should just, if we go to the second page, we can see what that is. So Dr. Gunson wrote to Mr. Canavan, enclosing a copy of his letter to you, which we've already looked at, Dr. Lloyd, and referring to a call he'd had from Ortho and then saying, I fear the worst. That's what Dr. Raymond's referring to. If we go back to the first page, please, in Dr. Raymond's memo. Point 2, he says this gives details of routine anti-HCV screening at Newcastle RTC, which commenced last week. 3, this action was taken despite the agreed policy by the ACVSB that screening should start simultaneously in all the RTCs in the UK. 4, this had also been agreed by the RTC directors with the National Director of the NBTS. Just pausing there. That appears to suggest that a policy of simultaneous screening was the consensus view or agreed by RTC directors. Was that your understanding, that this had been agreed by RTC directors?
Correspondence I received and phone calls I received, it was quite clear that all the other directors believed that we were going to start on the same day. So yes, I have to say it was agreed. I do not recall actually being in a meeting where I said I agree to start on the same day. I might have done, possible, particularly when we thought the test was being introduced fairly promptly. So yes, it's. I think it's fair to say RTC directors agreed with the national director that it should start simultaneously. Yes.
And then Dr. Raymond's observation in paragraph 5, and obviously we can ask him about this, but it says, this action has caused problems in that the other major competitor company feels disadvantaged and has also caused problems in Scotland. We're all waiting for written reasons as to why this action was taken, and then he says he's copying it to members of the management executive to determine whether action is required where an individual region decides to oppose a universal agreement. Do you have any observations, Dr. Lloyd, on paragraph 5, whether the problems it said have been caused are disadvantage to the other competitor company and unspecified problems in Scotland?
I have absolutely no sympathy for a large commercial company that happens to feel disadvantaged over something that happens. They're in the business of making money, and I'm quite sure many companies, and you see it in the newspapers occasionally, companies come up and complain that they feel they've been disadvantaged by something that's happened, by some government decision or whatever. Of course they're going to come up and say that. They don't want to be left behind. They don't want to make less money. So I certainly feel no sympathy, if that's the right word. You know, tough. They're a big business. They're a multinational corporation, and they can look after themselves. As to Scotland, I'm not quite sure what was being suggested here. Whether it means that the Scottish NBTS was now put in the same position as as the other transfusion centres in England. Although somewhere along the line, I have a feeling that the Scottish centres were also prepared to start earlier. I do note that with the exception of the letter from Dr. Ruthven Mitchell, which, as I said, was a moderate, reasonable letter, none of the other centre directors from Scotland actually wrote and complained about my decision to start testing. So maybe the Scottish blood transfusion services were not as comfortable with the delay, apart from obviously John Cash.
Were you surprised that the introduction by you of a measure designed to improve patient safety triggered such a response from others?
When I decided to introduce the test, I knew there was going to be a backlash, or I was pretty sure. And when I reread those letters, what I note is that nobody mentions the patients. Jolly good show. No one's going to break ranks. And I sort of felt there was something wrong with that. Wrong focus.
Just a handful of further questions about the correspondence and so on at this time. First of all, NHBT 000074_026. You wrote to Dr. Gunson on the 9th of May 1991. You referred to Dr. Contreras' letter and said your impression was that there was a concerted attempt to obtain funding from the Department of Health. Was this an agreed strategy? And then you posed the question, would you be good enough to let me know whether there was in fact a strategy which involved delaying the introduction of the tests while awaiting central funding for this test? As far as I'm aware, no previous communication has indicated that the start date for the test depended on funding direct from the Department of Health. Now, do you recall if you had an answer from Dr. Gunson to that question? Was there a deliberate strategy here?
I certainly don't recall any response. I've obviously read obviously I wrote it. But no, I don't recall ever receiving an answer to that.
Now, one of the things that happened next, and we can pick this up at NHBT 0000192_024, was the suggestion that your action would be regarded as a trial and not the commencement of routine testing. So we can see this is the letter from Dr. Gunson to all RTDs, 9th of May 1991. We can pick it up, I think, bottom of the page. Dr. Lloyd's premature introduction of the test, however, can be used to extend the scope of the evaluation if it's developed as part of a national policy. To this end, DH have agreed that two other RTCs in England, namely Leeds and Liverpool, will take part in an extended trial using the Ortho second-generation kit. This will still be regarded as a trial and not the commencement of routine testing. There's further communication in relation to that suggestion. You've characterised it in your statement as a face-saving exercise and a charade, and I just wondered if you would care to elaborate upon that.
Yeah, certainly at the time when this came out, when Dr. Gunson started talking about an extended trial, my immediate reaction was that this was just Dr. Gunson trying to save face. He'd told the department or the ACBSB, we're doing it all together, no problem here. And then this guy goes and does this differently, upsets everybody. And now somehow Dr. Gunson has got to save face either amongst the directors or the Department of Health. So I saw this as nothing more than a face-saving exercise. And I think you do have, again, some of that correspondence between Dr. Gunson and Simon Pearl, that that's exactly what this was. And I think there was also a letter that he wrote to Dr. Contreras in which he suggests that this was not a genuine trial that he was proposing.
And if we just go to the third page of this document, please, Sally. This is a brief to answer press queries, line to take, being set out by Dr. Gunson. I'm not going to go through all of it, but if we can just go towards the bottom of the page. Under, or just above paragraph 6, legal liability, there's a heading, importance of testing. And the suggested line to take is this: the new test will improve the safety of the blood supply, but it should be noted that hepatitis C is normally only a mild infection, not like AIDS. Now, you have some observations from that in your statement, Dr. Lloyd, but I just wondered if you could tell us orally what your response is to that.
That's a really quite outrageous statement to be putting out and suggesting that people should pass it on to the general public. Dr. Gunson knew that wasn't true. People who unfortunately, were HIV infected, developed AIDS and died, and there are people who contracted hepatitis C and developed severe disease, cirrhosis, and died. Normally only a mild infection? No, sorry. That's wrong.
And then if I can just pick up a couple of other letters. NHBT 0000076_009. This is a letter you wrote to Dr. Gunson on the 24th of June 1991. You say in the second paragraph, oh no, so first paragraph is what I wanted to pick up, second sentence. The fact that many other countries have been testing for about a year now, and in some cases longer, makes the UK position look increasingly unrealistic and very hard to defend. Now, I'm not going to go through with you all the other dates for the other countries. We have those as a matter of record.
Are we actually looking on the same
Oh,
page?
sorry. First page, Sally, first paragraph.
Thank you.
Thank you. So it's the second sentence of that first paragraph. The fact that many other countries have been testing for about a year now, and in some cases longer, makes the UK position look increasingly unrealistic and very hard to defend. Do you recall any discussions taking place, whether they were at the division meetings that had replaced the RTD meetings, or with any others of your colleagues or with Dr. Gunson around this time, about this issue in relation to other countries? Did anyone ever come back to you with a response as to why this was not relevant?
No, I don't recall anyone coming back on this issue. No, I can't think of anybody coming back and saying, well, it doesn't, it's not relevant. I mean, you can make arguments about the United States had a much bigger problem, therefore testing earlier might have made, might have been appropriate to them, but not to us. But I don't recall anyone coming to me and saying, look, this is why this sort of position of us being late doesn't matter.
And then if we look at the penultimate paragraph on this page, beginning the second of these valid criticisms, so this is about not giving other centres adequate warning. You say the second of these valid criticisms resulted from my view that had I informed everyone earlier, pressure would have been brought to bear to stop me instituting testing, a course that I believed was right and am now even more convinced was right. I think you say in your statement, Dr. Lloyd, that your real concern was that somehow an instruction might be issued from the Department of Health to instruct you not to go ahead. Is that right?
Yes, that was my line of thinking. I didn't think I was going to be stopped from doing it just by sort of peer pressure. I thought if I was going to be stopped, it would have to come through the Department of Health, because Dr. Gunson had I had no line accountability to Dr. Gunson. He couldn't stop me directly. He was the advisor on the advisory. Going to happen, and then through the Department of Health, back through to the Regional Health Authority, and then my boss would have said, "Don't do it." So that was what I was worried about happening.
I think we lost a few seconds.
Fortunately, yes, that's what I thought would happen. Would be that the route would be from the Department of Health through to the Regional Health Authority, where the person I reported to would then tell me not to start testing. But of course, I was fortunate also in having discussed this in advance with senior people at the Regional Health Authority. And I have to thank, I think it was at the time, Professor Liam Donaldson, who supported me, certainly understood the issues, a very savvy individual.
And then if we can look at a memo you wrote in June of 1991 setting out your reflections, NHBT 0000192_092, uh, 18th of June 1991. It's not to anyone. It reads as though this may be, as it were, a note to yourself, almost, for the record. It was,
right? Yes. It was a note to myself. I occasionally did that. Helped me remember things.
And I'm not going to read through the detail of it. You refer to a meeting held in York. I think that was the northern region that had met. If we look down at the...
I think it was on the 14th of June, I think.
And then if we look down the bottom of the page, just want to look at the last paragraph, you say this: at the end of this meeting, I felt confident that as a centre we had made the right decision to proceed with hepatitis C testing when we did. My only regret is that we didn't introduce it earlier. The coordinating activity of the National Directorate appears to have provided us with a lowest common denominator approach rather than a best possible approach. And as I understand your statement, Dr. Lloyd, this remains your position. Your only regret now still is that that you didn't do it earlier than you did.
Absolutely, yeah, and I'm sorry for that.
Do you have a sense of how much earlier you could have introduced it on a local basis in Newcastle, given the other constraints about the way in which the ACVSB was taking its decisions and so on?
Yeah, there's a number of issues there. If you take the purely logistical issue, we had the wherewithal to introduce the first generation test earlier because we had run the trial. So technically we could have continued to test when the trial ended. So that's a sort of a technical issue. The second issue is as we mentioned before, the ACVSB had noted in November that we should start testing as soon as practicable, I think the word was. We could then perhaps at that stage have gone to the Regional Health Authority and said, do you have some remaining sort of emergency funds which you would be prepared to use so that we can purchase this test kit for the first couple of months of 1991 before the new financial year starts. You know, if we'd gone to them in November, perhaps they could have found funding for sort of January, February, March. What I say I didn't know, perhaps I did know, but I hadn't thought about it in that way, was that we couldn't start testing without the Department of Health approval and the Minister's approval. So there was there would have been a real problem with starting testing before that approval, which I think was given on the 22nd of January 1991. But even then, we could possibly have started testing in January if the Regional Health Authority had some residual funding to fund the test.
May I just ask about the funding? The position was, as I understand it, that at this time cross-charging was in place. Am I right?
Yes, sir.
So one way of
Sorry,
getting the money is to increase the price of the product supplied, that part of the budget.
At that point, that's a valid point, except that I thought that because that sort of change, I would be one person going out to the whole series of health trusts and hospitals to try and renegotiate a contract, something I wouldn't do without the region. And if I don't know enough about all the regional funding issues, whether they would have had money that they could have in turn released to the hospital trusts and so on for them to bring it back. I might have been in a very strange position of having approval for an increase in funding or an agreement to increase funding by some hospitals, but not by others. That would have been difficult.
Yes, I see. Thank you very much.
And then, excuse me, a couple of other documents, picking up on something you've referred to about Dr. Gunson's later communications. Could we start with NHBT 00-88807? So this is one of the documents I think you were referring to. This is now February 1999, and I anticipate is in the context of the litigation which we know was brought against the National Blood Authority. And it's Dr. Gunson writing to Dr. Barbara, and then we've got the reference in the first paragraph to Simon Pearl, who you correctly say was a solicitor in the firm representing the NBA. And it would appear that there's a request from the solicitor to expand Dr. Gunson's report to demonstrate that your decision, Dr. Lloyd, was maverick and premature. We see in this next paragraph, Dr. Gunson says, with the benefit of hindsight, I have indicated that we should have introduced routine testing without the second evaluation, or at least tested the 10,000 or so frozen donations whilst using the test routinely. I think we will be criticised severely for not doing this, since there were many countries throughout the world where the second-generation tests had to directly supersede the use of first-generation tests. By April 91, only Denmark and some countries in the Netherlands and Italy were not screening routinely. And then this, however, I suppose we have to reinforce the arguments which were put forward in 1991, since we must have believed in them as proper ones to take at that time. There's then a comment, some comments on a paper from Dr. Barbara that we don't, I'm afraid, have or haven't located, which sets out a number of matters. But if we go over the page, just want to pick it up in the third paragraph, where Dr. Gunson says the decision to carry out the comparative evaluation of the Ortho and Abbott second-generation tests was made by ACVSB on the 25th of February 1991 on the grounds that the second-generation tests had not been licensed by FDA. I think we must support this policy decision, even though I think that we may face some difficult questions on how the second-generation tests were introduced into other countries where screening had commenced with first-generation tests. And then bottom of the page, he says, I do not know how he resolved these problems since I did not discuss them with him. I did have cri de coeur from a Dr. Codd at the Newcastle PHLS asking what he should do. Do you have any understanding of what that refers to, Dr. Lloyd?
Arthur Codd, who was a consultant with the Newcastle Public Health Laboratory Service. I suspect that we probably threw some requests for confirmatory testing at him, and he was a delightful gentleman, but I think probably got a little bit flustered and wasn't quite sure if he was going to get into difficulties for supporting what we did. So that's probably the sort of lines that this was taking.
And then we see Dr. Gunson explains he's thinking of responding to Simon Pearl in terms roughly as set out above. I think it's important that our efforts, that's his and Dr. Barbara's, correspond reasonably well. And then if we go to the report from Dr. Gunson and Dr. Barbara, or the statement, I should say, that's then produced at NHBT 008813_002, NHBT 008813_002. So we can see it's a joint statement by Dr. Barbara, Dr. Gunson, entitled Unilateral Introduction of Anti-Htv Testing at Newcastle RTC in April 1991. Now, I know you've had an opportunity to look at this, so there are only two passages I'm going to ask you about, Dr. Lloyd. Second page, bottom half of the page, it says, Dr. Lloyd did not raise any objections to the agreed starting date of 1st of July. However, we can only conclude that he intended to begin testing in April 1991, since he used the specious argument for taking this premature action that he wished to ensure that all products for issue had been tested by 1st of July. And then that refers, I think, to the letter that we've already looked at, or one of them.
Yeah.
Do you have any observations about what's set out there?
Yes, as I said, the letter I sent to Dr. Gunson referring to 1st of July, I think as I said before, I was trying to protect my own back a little bit by sort of making out that I wasn't quite as forthright in starting this testing when I did. The 1st of July, when we say here it's a specious argument, there is some truth in that. It actually wasn't the reason I started testing, but when Barbara and Gunson saw that, they could use that information in this way. So perhaps not unreasonable given what I had written.
And then the last part I wanted to ask you about in this document is on the last page. Last paragraph. There's no doubt that Dr. Lloyd's decision was not in the interest of the service as a whole and was taken in the knowledge that he was flaunting the decisions of the Department of Health, who had made it clear through the ACVSB that they were the responsible body to determine when routine anti-HCV testing should start and the steps which should be taken prior to its introduction. Any observations, Dr. Lloyd, on that, and in particular the suggestion that this was not in the interest of the service as a whole?
Yes, certainly some observations. First of all, I'll come back to your question about in the interest of the service as a whole. Flaunting the decisions of the Department of Health. Well, I wasn't party to the minutes of the ACVSB, and so I only had limited knowledge of what their position was as provided through Dr. Gunson. Secondly, by the time I started testing, the ACVSB had already said, you will start testing. So this argument that they were the responsible body to determine when testing should start doesn't hold water in this case. They'd already said, go ahead. They had handed it over to Dr. Gunson to arrange the starting. So then we come back to the interest of the service as a whole. Well, what is missing in that statement is, what about the patients? It's corporate speak, interest of the service, never mind about the safety of the blood we're issuing. I think that's it.
And then can I ask you, and this is now just really on a point of detail rather than the issues of principle which we've been discussing, can I ask you to look at WITN 6935035. This is a letter from Dr. Collins, 3rd of January 1991. And it says it's a letter for donors who have been tested and whose test results suggests hepatitis C positivity. I just wondered if you can assist us in understanding the significance of this in terms of the date. Was this a draft in anticipation of the later introduction of testing, do you know?
No, I think if you scroll up to the top of the document, if you would please, you'll see at the top that although it's under Dr. Collins' name, our reference shows that it was myself who drafted this, and 3rd of January 91, this was after we had done the first generation test. So yes, this must have been preparing ourselves for the introduction of testing. I'm just looking at the date. Yes, it was written on the 3rd of January. The reference number confirms that it was actually written, typed up on the 3rd of January. So it has to have been in anticipation of starting. I can't think why else I would have prepared that document at that stage.
An alternative explanation could be, and sorry, you've frozen, Dr. Lloyd, so I'll just wait till we have you.
Following on, sorry.
Carry on.
Thank you. It is possible that I wrote this letter as a follow-on to the first generation study that we did. And as we got results back, confirmatory testing results back, I drafted this so that Dr. Collins could contact those. There is something in that letter, if I recall, that mentions 2 tests. Is that correct?
Yes, the first paragraph says, when you donated blood recently, we included 2 new tests for a form of hepatitis or jaundice virus.
So this letter does refer to the comparative first generation study we did.
I think that
so
was
this is as the results of that study. Yeah, that's where it came from then, because it says two tests.
And then just in terms of once testing was fully operational across the northern region, I think there came a point in the course of 1992 when it appears you learnt that Dr. Collins had not been communicating to donors who had tested positive the fact of their positive test and what steps they should take, for example, seeing a doctor and so on.
Yes.
The reference, just for the transcript, I don't propose to go to it, is NHBT 0003991. How had that happened and what steps were taken to rectify that situation?
The steps to rectify, as soon as we found out, we sort of piled resources in to get the letters out. Dedicated a secretary to help with it, and we got on and got the letters out. How it came about, obviously as a consultant, I couldn't sort of go to Dr. Collins and sort of look over her shoulder and say, what are you doing? She had a degree of autonomy and responsibility for doing the work, and it is regrettable that I didn't realize that she wasn't doing this work. I mean, it was a pretty straightforward piece of business to, she received the results. I think we'd probably help to draft, we've got these drafts like this, letters like this, so we knew what we were going to do, but for some reason she was unable to carry it out. And I don't really want to go into why she couldn't carry it out, but she didn't.
Dr. Lloyd, I'm going to move in a moment to 3 further short topics of questioning I have for you. But before I do so, on the question of the introduction of hepatitis C screening, is there anything further that you would want to say or that we haven't covered in your statement?
No, I don't. Nothing sort of springs to mind. All I can say is it gave me some sleepless nights at the time. It wasn't an easy decision. I was certainly concerned for my position, but thankfully, we got through it. But I don't think there's anything else.
So I'm going to move now to an issue about the introduction of hepatitis B core antibody testing, not as a surrogate measure for non-A, non-B hepatitis, but in relation to hepatitis B itself. If we pick this up at WITN 6935033, this is a memo from you. I think it's an internal memo from the names. 18th of May 93.
It is.
It refers to you having spoken to Dr. Gunson regarding hepatitis B core antibody testing. He says the results of the trial have now been completed and are being presented to the appropriate Department of Health Committee on Virological Safety. And then the next paragraph discusses the test results. And then the third paragraph, with regard to the date of implementation of the test in the UK, Dr. Gunson says he does not know when this will be, but thinks it will be in the autumn. As usual, it looks as if the National Directorate, now the NBA, and the Department of Health are being incredibly slow in their deliberations, and of course should have introduced this test earlier this year, given the information they had available from the Liverpool study. Is it right to understand from this, Dr. Lloyd, that your assumption and Dr. Gunson's assumption was that this test would be introduced? That the only question really was when, rather than whether?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, once again, in this case, referring to Sir Brian's comment, we included the increased cost in the supply of blood, but of course we were doing that before the year's contracts were negotiated. So we had informed hospitals that we were going to introduce the test. Our haematologists in the region knew we were going to introduce the test. We were ready. I recall we had discussed it with our supplier, Abbott, so that they were prepared to deliver to us the suitable number of tests. So yes, we were ready to go. And as you say in that comment, I suggest that Dr. Gunson also was expecting to start.
And the reference to being, as usual, incredibly slow in their deliberations, is that hearkening back to the then not too distant past of the issue relating to hepatitis C screening, do you think, or were there other issues that you had in mind?
No, I think I was just referring to hepatitis C.
And is this right that the Newcastle Centre, or the Northern Region, had been involved in the trial of the anti-HBC test kits?
Yes, I think we had. I think I've seen somewhere a few sheets of paper sort of showing some results. So yes, we did do some work on it. I can't remember the results we got in terms of incidence.
Just for the transcript.
But I noticed in that.
Carry on.
Sorry. I noticed at the bottom of this that we're talking about the information they had available from the Liverpool study. I may have seen it at the time, but obviously that was a study that I thought at the time was of note.
And I won't go to it, but there's a letter from Dr. Gunson to you in February of '93, which refers to your participation in the trial of test kits from Abbott and Pasteur, and the reference for the transcript is NHBT 00-18413. Can I then pick up this issue about anti-HBC testing with a meeting in July of '93, NHBT 00-16372_001. So we can see it's a meeting of RTDs / chief executives / general managers. And if we go to page 4.
Sorry, you said it was a meeting of RTDs, and we lost the sound after that.
Yes, it was a meeting on the 27th of July '93 of RTDs, chief executives / general managers, and you were present along with a number of others who fell into that category. If we look at page 4, picking it up at paragraph 6.1, under the heading UK Advisory Committee on Transfusion Transmitted Diseases, you'll see there a reference to considerable concern was expressed about the delay which had occurred by the Department of Health's insistence on deciding whether and when routine anti-HBC should be introduced. There's a reference to events during the past year in France. Dr. Gunson confirmed he'd written to Dr. Metters stating that the UK Advisory Committee on Transfusion Transmitted Disease had decided from a scientific point of view that such routine testing is warranted, and that the latest series of tests shown that there are test kits which are satisfactory, although all give false positive results. It was recognised that the UK Advisory Committee on Transfusion Transmitted Diseases is not in a position to decide that the tests can be introduced. However, it was agreed unanimously that the NBA should have the authority to make this decision. Dr Gunson and Mr Adey would ask the chairman of the authority if he'd speak to the Ministry of Health on this important transfer of policy decisions from the DH to the NBA. So we can see what's set out there, I think, is self-evident. Do you have any recollection of the discussions at the meeting?
No, I don't recall what else was said. I think that minute is fairly clear on where people were on this, with the Department of Health making the decisions, and whereas it really should have been by that stage the NBA's responsibility. I may not have liked the NBA, but I mean it was a clearly established, correctly established body. It had responsibility for the transfusion service in England and Wales, and therefore it should have had the authority to introduce the necessary tests as and when they saw appropriate.
And then if we pick matters up towards the end of 1993, at NHBT 0005291_003, this is a letter from you dated the 8th of November 93 to all consultant haematologists, finance managers and blood transfusion contract holders. This particular letter is addressed to Dr Hamilton. As you know, we included provision for hepatitis B core antibody testing in this year's BTS contracts. One regional transfusion centre had started testing. There were clear indications that the UK would introduce this test, and then we see the purpose of it here described by you, to eliminate the small number of hepatitis B transmissions by blood transfusion that occur due to a small group of individuals who are infectious but are negative for hepatitis B surface antigen, for which we currently test. So just pausing there, the purpose of this testing was to pick up this group who would not otherwise be picked up by the existing HBsAg testing, and meant that cases of hepatitis B transmission by blood transfusion did still occur. Is that right?
Yes. My understanding was that there were still some infectious units that the surface antigen test was not picking them up. And I wish I could see the Liverpool study to sort of actually see the numbers. But obviously it was sufficient to make people, such as Dr. Gunson, realise that this test should be introduced.
And then we can see, next paragraph, at the beginning of this year, we were asked not to start this test and to wait until the whole country started testing. We've now been informed that this test is not to be introduced. This instruction coming from the Department of Health, I'm told that this decision was not taken lightly. Now, we'll obviously need to pick up elsewhere the Department of Health's own decision-making process. Do you recall any more about how and when you learnt of the Department of Health's decision?
No. And as we know, the advisory committee of the Department of Health, their minutes were not for circulation, so we wouldn't have seen anything about how they came to this decision, and not taking it lightly, find that difficult. And putting it in context, the Department of Health, both for HIV testing and for hepatitis C testing, made decisions not to fund the testing directly, but to just offload it onto the health authorities and the hospital services to just take up the cost. So how they came to this decision not to introduce a test that increased safety when they were almost certainly never going to have to deal with the financial implications, I find difficult to understand.
It would appear that Dr. Hamilton, to whom this was addressed, was troubled by the decision. We can see that from NHBT 0005291_002. So Dr. Hamilton, who was Dr. Peter Hamilton, a haematologist at the Royal Victoria Infirmary, was here 3 days later seeking advice from solicitors. He referred to the letter he'd received from you and then said, this is the consultant in administrative charge of blood bank at this hospital. I am charged with the issue of safe blood to patients. It would seem that although there is a test which could improve the safety of the blood issued in my name, it appears that for financial reasons in this country it's been decided not to use it. And then he refers to the criminal prosecutions in France and asks for reassurance as to his position. Just one further document, I think, and on this issue, which is at NHBT 0097150 or 50 underscore 007, please. So this is a newspaper article in the Times, April 1995. So it's a year and a half or so later. If we just pick it up in the middle column, second paragraph down from the top, I think we can leave the whole thing on screen, Sally, at the moment. It says, Dr. Hugh Lloyd, a former director of the Northern Regional Blood Transfusion Centre in Newcastle upon Tyne, said he'd been strongly in favour of introducing the hepatitis B test, known as anti-HBC screening. There was sufficient information to suggest that it would improve the safety of blood transfusions. So we're now in the top right-hand column. His centre made all the arrangements for the test to be introduced last year, but was then instructed not to go ahead. I think that was not the right decision to make, said Dr. Lloyd, who has left the service. And then if we go to the bottom half of the page, left-hand side, we can see there's reference to other countries using anti-HBC testing. There's reference to people in the service being angry. And then picking it up, it says, Dr. Lloyd said that the test could have been introduced relatively inexpensively, but if you're not very keen on it, you can make out that there are a lot of additional costs. And then there's a reflection of the concern of Dr. Peter Hamilton, and it would appear he wrote to the BMJ in January 1994 about it. Is that article an accurate reflection of your views as at 1995?
Lost it.
Do you have us back?
Is that article an
Accurate reflection of your views as at 1995?
Yes, it is. Apart from the comment in the second section, right-hand column, right at the end, Dr. Lloyd, however, agrees with the health department's decision in this case. I don't know how that comment came about because it does not match anything I had said earlier.
I think that's a reference to testing for HTLV1, Dr. Lloyd.
Is it? Oh,
yes.
I see.
That's how I read it.
Yes, thank you for that. Yes, no, you're quite right.
Yeah, as opposed to the anti-HBC.
But okay. But anti-HVC, yes, that was my feeling at the time. I think that's a fairly accurate reflection of what I was thinking, and we see some, Dr. Peter Hamilton was good at coming forward and stating the point clearly, and I have to agree with him.
May I just ask? I suspect I know the answer, but I will ask you anyway, and you can confirm what I think may be the case. You did not, in this case, go it alone in Newcastle.
No.
Could you have done so had you wished?
I don't think so. We were under... I can't remember the exact moment in which we were transferred to the NBA. Once we were part of the NBA, that was certainly not something I could have done on my own. You're in a different situation. If it had been before, I think there's some of the documents we've just seen make it much clearer that the Department of Health has the authority and said no. And they said no before I was planning to introduce it anyway. So, don't do the test comes before the point at which we had planned to introduce it. So there would have been a difficulty going ahead, certainly.
Yes, well, thank you very much.
So I've got about another 10 to 15 minutes of questions for Dr. Lloyd. And what I was going to suggest, if it's okay with you and Dr. Lloyd, is I carry on now, complete my questioning, and then we need only have one, perhaps slightly longer break to enable core participants to suggest questions rather than the 2 breaks. And that way we ought to be able to finish Dr. Lloyd's evidence today.
Yes, Dr. Lloyd, you can have a break now, should you wish, but you've heard what Council has had to say.
No.
It's a choice between having 2 breaks, one now and one shortly afterwards, or just the one. The purpose of the break, the slightly longer break, is, as Council has said, it's to allow those who are participant in the inquiry to suggest questions to be put to you, so that there is every chance that every question that people significantly wish to ask may be answered from your evidence. Well, we'll continue. Unless you want to stop.
Yes, please continue.
So, Dr. Lloyd,
please continue.
The topic I'm going to ask you about now is clinical transfusion practice. So the extent to which transfusions were used in hospitals and whether they were used more than they needed to be, and what measures, educational or persuasive measures, were or were not taken by the Regional Transfusion Centre in that regard. Can I just start by asking you to cast your mind back to that's the second half of the 1970s, when you were working in your house officer posts in a range of different disciplines. Do you recall whether, either as from your medical training or through those 5 years or so of house officer work, whether there were ever discussions or guidance or advice about minimising the use of blood and blood products?
I did, it sort of brought it back. One of the documents presented by the inquiry is notes on transfusion dated, I think, 1977. Now, that was a little after I was into my sort of general clinical jobs. I certainly recall carrying that notebook, that little set of notes with me. And I think that does refer to issues of using blood and that there are safety issues. In my training, there was very little said about transfusion. We didn't have a lot of, I can't recall having a lot of information about the risks of transfusion. So after that, in the first few years, we just used it, and I was working, particularly my first job, in a relatively small hospital. So I don't think there was a lot of general knowledge of transfusion. I don't think we had a hematologist. I know we didn't have a hematologist there. When I moved to the North Tees General Hospital in the second half of 1975, we did have a hematologist, Dr. Roger Finney, and I think sort of I did discuss issues of transfusion when there were things I needed to know. I would discuss them with him, so that there was discussion, and I don't think I was really ever in a position of wanting to or needing to sort of do single unit top-ups. Perhaps that's partly because of the type of patients I was dealing with. So yes, during those years there was discussion, not massive, but things like notes on transfusion did provide some backdrop to the fact that there are safety issues. I don't recall throwing this stuff around like confetti.
And then, whether by reference to those SHO years or then in the 1980s when you began to concentrate on haematology and transfusion, and you had some experience with blood banking and so on, Do you recall what the position was in terms of record keeping? Were there, how meticulous or rigorous an approach were you instructed or advised to take in the hospitals, from the hospital's perspective, about ensuring that there were clear records of what was transfused and to whom, both in the blood bank and in the patient's records?
Oh, in the patient's records, it was certainly drummed into me that we always recorded the information on transfusions, the donation number and what was transfused. So that went into the patient's record, and that was very much an imperative that we did that. Hospital blood banking, the way in which records were kept was varied. When I worked at the Freeman Hospital, there was one of the two consultant hematologists, initially one, Dr. Mansour Qureshi, very, very interested and concerned about record keeping, to the extent that he wrote computer programs to help the department keep accurate records of what was happening. The other two hospitals would have been more manual. I can't remember exactly how they did it. But yeah, keeping records was certainly an important issue. Level of importance, as I say, Dr. Qureshi was certainly up there amongst the top, wanting to make sure we had everything correctly recorded.
And then if we could look at a document you've exhibited to your statement, please. It's WITN 6935018. This is headed, Transfusion, do we have any choice? The answer is yes and no. In many instances, there is no choice, but in some cases, there is a choice. The main choices can be summarised as follows. Reduce your threshold for transfusing. Make judgments on clinical state, not just on the value. Have a maximum blood order schedule and do not transfuse blood just because it's been cross-matched. Use volume expanders, use autologous techniques, and then you refer to the possible use of blood substitutes. First of all, what was this document? Was this notes for a lecture or talk you were giving?
Yes, this was notes for a talk I was giving. Can't remember exactly who I was talking to, but one of the hospitals, perhaps out at one of the hospitals. So I did do invited to talk here and there, and that's what this is. Just personal notes to me that I could use for talking. It was probably supported by some slides.
And I just wanted to ask you a little more about the second and third of those choices. That make judgments on clinical state, not just on the value. What did you mean by that?
Well, not just on the value of the hemoglobin. So look at the clinical state of the patient. Is this patient in distress or having difficulties because their hemoglobin is low, or are they actually coping with their current hemoglobin level? Don't just top it up to a nominal value. And of course, the next one, have a maximum blood order schedule, which is sort of a more organizational policy, particularly aimed at the more junior staff in a department. Junior staff are going to be more cautious and therefore over-order blood because they don't want to get caught out and be screamed at for not having enough blood ready for some procedure, particularly in surgery. So if you provide them with a maximum blood order schedule, you're allowing them to order less blood and not put themselves, or perceived to put themselves, in a difficult position.
And do you know when that process of having this idea of the maximum blood order schedule, when that was introduced in the region?
Oh, it wouldn't have been introduced across the region as a single process, but you have to remember, in the northern region, most of the haematologists, well, all the haematologists, possibly bar one, met on a fairly regular schedule. It's not a schedule, but there was a regular meeting every Friday at the Royal Victoria Infirmary. And haematologists would come in, excuse me, would come a crossover of information between them and discussions. So things would tend to, to permeate across the region, perhaps faster than in an area, in a region that didn't have this very good little meeting.
And I think we can see a reference to those meetings. I can't remember. We can see a reference to those meetings and to hospital transfusion committees at NHBT 0009710. These are the notes of a November 91 visit to the RTC by Dr. Arlo and Dr. Hewitt. But if we just go to page 2...
Yes.
If we pick it up at the bottom half of the page, first of all, paragraph 1.3, regional transfusion committees, it says there's no regional transfusion committee. The Northern Region Consultant Haematologist Group meets twice a year. There's also a weekly informal meeting of the regional haematologists, which the RTD attends. Is that what you were referring to?
That was, yes, correct. That's what I was referring to.
And do you know when that weekly practice started? Was it already ongoing when you came back to the centre in 86, 87?
That was going back, that was operating back in 1981. I recall going to it as a registrar and Dr. Collins saying, you should get across to that meeting. So that meeting had been going for a long time. I suspect it was instituted by Professor William Walker.
And then the next paragraph refers to 3 monthly haematology audits. It says they're topic orientated and have included transfusion matters. Is that a system with which you were, or a process with which you were involved at the transfusion service, or was that done with the region and the hospitals themselves?
I think that was I think that was the region and the hospitals. It wasn't something driven by us. We were perhaps not as intrusive into the hospital blood banking as we might have been. And you will perhaps note from other things I've said that when I became chief executive, we were able to appoint a consultant to become the head of our medical service, specifically to sort of recognizing that I didn't have enough time to devote to some of these issues, such as hospital transfusion committees. And of course, a bit like Anne Collins before me, for a number of years, I had very little in the way of other sort of consultant level support.
And if we look at the top of the page, we can just pick up the reference to hospital transfusion committees. It says 20/21 hospital transfusion departments are serviced by the RTC. Of these, 3/4 have set up hospital transfusion committees. These generally meet at 3 monthly intervals. The RTC is not actively involved, but 2 of the HTCs invite an RTC consultant as appropriate. It sounds as though the establishment of the hospital transfusion committees by the 3 or 4 hospitals was relatively recent at that point in time. Does that accord with your recollection?
I think so. I mean, you said this was 1991.
November 91.
When
the
Dr. Allo and Dr. Hewitt, yes, when Dr. Hewitt and Dr. Allo visited. So I think there was a hospital transfusion committee at the Freeman Hospital before that, when I was still perhaps a senior registrar. But they would have been one of the sort of one of the hospitals that tended to be at the forefront of that sort of issue.
Looking back now, Dr. Lloyd, do you think there is more that could have been done, whether by the regional transfusion service or by the hospitals and within the region, or indeed nationally, perhaps by the Chief Medical Officer or the Department of Health, to reinforce the message about using transfusion appropriately and encouraging and educating doctors and nurses about the better use of transfusion?
Certainly, you can always do better. I could have spent more time and sort of recognised that I wasn't spending as much time as I, should in working at that level with the hospitals. But we did have the Northern Region did have a good group of consultant haematologists. So, they understood these issues. Prior to a hospital getting a consultant haematologist, you were left with a pathologist looking after the issues, and at that time, that would have, I'm sure there wouldn't have been the same pressure on teaching people how to use transfusion properly. But once you got the haematologists there, that was changing, and you saw that when we had meetings with the haematologists from around the regions, only twice a year. We were able to work with them to change transfusion practice, and the reduction in the use of whole blood was also, we also talked about single unit transfusions. So yes, could have done more, but I don't think the Northern Region at that time, into the 1990s, was doing too badly.
And then last on this topic, NHBT 0072687_001. This is a letter from you to a consultant cardiothoracic surgeon at the Freeman Hospital, Mr. Hilton, 11th of June 1990. Says, following the recent episode in which you phoned myself requiring that we provide blood bags for you to collect blood from staff in theatre for the provision of immediate blood transfusion, I feel I need to reply to you and make my position clear. And then you go on to describe these procedures as highly dangerous, both because of the lack of proper blood grouping and the risks from that, and then the third paragraph, the fact that the blood would not have been tested for hepatitis B or HIV antibodies. Obviously, this is before the introduction of the hepatitis C testing. And then you go on to discuss the practice of using fresh whole blood in cardiac or cardiothoracic surgery. Do you recall how, if at all, this issue was resolved?
Well, you'll also see in witness statements that one of the haematologists at the Freeman Hospital was saying something very similar to myself, that this wasn't a suitable procedure. I don't know. I think that was probably a letter from Dr. Patrick Kestervan to Mr. Colin Hilton. I would imagine that they worked it out between them, but I don't recall any sort of long-term follow-up. I did get a copy of it's in one of the documents in the inquiry. Another letter from Colin reminding me that they were not the only people wanting to use fresh whole blood in that clinical situation. I have no problem with them using fresh whole blood if was the best thing for the clinical care of the patient. I was concerned about it being done safely. And I wasn't going to participate in an unsafe procedure. But I don't know where it went after that.
And then my final topic, Dr. Lloyd, is in relation to record keeping. We've covered already in your statement and the documents we've got refers to the record keeping systems at the centre and your introduction of the various computerised systems. So I'm not proposing to ask you more about that. But you were involved in the production of a report about record storage, which is at NHBT 0071590_001. So record storage report for the NBTS in England and Wales, prepared on behalf of the National Directorate of the NBTS by Dr. Lloyd, Dr. Beale and Mr. Martina, April 1992. And then if we go to page 4, you can just pick up the introduction. So the report explains transfusion centres store a wide range of documents and records. And then...
Could
yes.
we bring that up? Could we bring that up on the screen, please?
Do you not have it on your screen?
I don't know. We've not moved on from Mr. Hilton's letter yet.
Let's try again. Could you reload it, Sally? Because it was on my screen, but have you got it now?
I have 1.1
Great.
introduction. Yes.
Great. So it says transfusion centres store a wide range of documents and records. And then if we skip down to the third paragraph, each group of documents or records can be reviewed as having to be retained for certain minimum periods to satisfy specific legal requirements. And then you say the need to retain documents and records for use in future potential litigation is increasing. As the level of litigation increases, it's imperative that major cases are not lost purely because the relevant documents are not available. And then if we I'll skip over the next paragraph, and then it says to be of value, any record system needs to be simple, robust and reliable. Now, before I ask you a couple of questions about the actual recommendations in the report, this introduction seems to be very much focused upon the fear of litigation. Was that the context in which this report was commissioned, or how did it come about that you and your colleagues were producing this?
I mean, obviously, Dr. Gunson asked for this report. He must have been concerned about retaining records. I know this little bit focuses on litigation, but I think you'll see elsewhere in the document that it actually focuses on, it actually includes a wide range of sort of legal requirements to retain records. Obviously, a lot of these records are retained because there is a potential to come back and for litigation. Whether that was Dr. Gunson's focus, I can't remember how I haven't seen any letter from him sort of giving me and Dr. Beale and Tony Martina a remit, a formal remit for doing this, for producing this. It's very much an organizational wide process that you might apply to any sort of large organization.
Well, if we go to page 7, please, Sally, top half of the page. We can see outline recommendations, and you identify there 3 categories. Long term, where the recommendation is to keep the records for 30 years. This covers donor and donation records and policy and management records, as well as records directly linked to donor and donation records, such as QA reports. And then you have intermediate term for a different category of documents, and transient term, which was 10 years, and then a transient term storage period for 2 years. There's more detail given about the categories, and in particular the inclusion of donor and donation records, pages 10 to 11 of the report. I'm not going to go through that. Mm-hmm. But if we turn to page 14, we can pick up the recommendation at the bottom of the page. In terms of a basic system, transfusion centres should institute a record storage system which enables records of potential significance for litigation to be retained for 30 years. And then the next paragraph says a record of the destruction of records should be maintained, including the destruction of originals after transfer of records to other storage media. A scheme such as the annual policy statement record should be instituted. Top of the next page. A formal written policy should be provided and followed. The system use should be audited. And then the next paragraph says the system proposed in this report can be adapted to each RTC's specific requirements. Do you know whether the recommendations in this report were implemented, either in the northern region or more generally across England and Wales?
I'll talk first about the Northern region. Yes, we implemented a policy, basically what was outlined in this document. We took a large room in the building, moved out what was in it, and created a record storage facility. We appointed, we gave someone the documents, and so we started down this route. So the documents were in proper cabinets, the sort of things you see sometimes in libraries that with big wheels that you move the cabinets up and down on tracks. Allows you to have high density storage, and yet you're able to access documents, find them very easily. And we certainly implemented the policy of keeping records of what we did. It sounds silly, records of records. But I mean, if you're going to keep a record, you need to know that you've kept it, what it's about, where it is. And if you decide to destroy it, you should, you identify why you destroyed it and when you destroyed it, or when you destroyed it and why you destroyed it. So that in the future, someone comes along and says, why haven't you kept, you know, such and such a record? You can go back to this long-term record that says, yes, this is where we looked at this, we made a decision, we destroyed it. This is why we did it. It wasn't just a lackadaisical thing. So in the centre, yes, we did start to follow this. Of course, we didn't have many years to do it. I believe, and this is very second-hand hearsay, through a colleague of mine after I'd left the service, who did say that the transfusion service were using this document. Didn't go into details, but he sort of said that this document was still being used by the service after I'd left. And you know, Tony and Alan Beale, Dr. Beale, you know, helped produce what I think was a pretty sound document, and thanks to them.
I think the inquiries had some evidence, or received some evidence, that the Red Book guidelines around this time were 15 years in relation to the kind of records you were here identifying should be kept for 30 years. Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Was that your understanding, and was the intention therefore to essentially depart from the Red Book guidance and create a longer-term storage system? Yes,
definitely. I think the three of us recognised that you couldn't sort of rely on things, you know, just saying, oh well, it's it's a certain number of years. You actually had to look to the future, and I do recall in this report I referred to litigation. I can't remember the person's name, but between an individual and English Electric Company, I think it is, in this report, someone who had pneumoconiosis. And there you see that the litigation was allowed to proceed long after what at the time were considered to be the sort of the limits on bringing cases to court. So we recognised that we couldn't rely on some of these other documents. And we also, I think, in this report say, yes, we've said 30 years, but when you start getting towards 30 years, you have documents that have been stored for 30 years, you need to stop and review your policy and decide whether you need to increase it again.
So those are the areas I'm proposing to cover with Dr. Lloyd. I've obviously inevitably been longer than I said I was going to half an hour ago. Can I suggest we take a longish break now, which will both give Dr. Lloyd a break, but will also enable me to consider questions and allow our legal representatives or core participants to formulate questions.
Well, how long do you think you need?
There's been quite a lot of interest in Dr. Lloyd's evidence, so I think if we took 40 minutes, that would give enough time and then enable us to conclude Dr. Lloyd's evidence today safely and not have to come back tomorrow.
Very well. we shall come back not before 5:15 for us. That's 12:15 for you, Dr. Lloyd. So not before 12:15.
Thank you.
I will be here.
Thank you.
Thank you.